Alright, so I've been thinking about a big problem that Hypixel Skyblock faces for a little while now, and I finally found the words to articulate the problem. Now, fundamentally, Hypixel Skyblock is actually not in a bad state. We're getting a lot of updates, a lot of those updates are pretty good, and we're getting more content now than we have in a long while, which is really great to see. But there is a problem that I think the game has, and it's most related to the fact that the player count for the game is not actively going up. In fact, it's still going down, even after the release of major pieces of content like foraging. And I've thought about why that may be, and I've only come to one conclusion because of the help of my community. I've asked people repeatedly over the last few weeks, why did you quit Hypixel Skyblock? Why did you stop playing? And the overall numbers were pretty shocking, at least to me. 70% of people quit because the grinds in the game are not fun or they're too long. Now, I think making the game more fun is somewhat nebulous and also would require an insane amount of work, right? Like, you would have to rework the majority of the game's systems to make a lot of current content enjoyable. I don't think the garden is going to become more fun to most people without a complete rework, and I think similar of a lot of other pieces of content in the game. So that's pushed me to another, probably more radical solution, which is greatly reducing the amount of time it takes to do the majority of the content in the game, especially to get to late game. I think once you're at the late game, end game level, progression is alright, it's reasonable at that point, but to get to late game, I don't think that the progression is very good. And what does this include? Well, it includes the mining early game, powder, forges, things like that, getting your first drills, etc. It includes farming as a whole. The entire skill is just way too bloated. It includes the fishing early game, it's just generally slow. Most drop rates of most popular items, especially stuff on the early cata floors, even the mid-game cata floors, a lot of stuff like some of the early slayers, some of the drop rates there are not particularly great. Bestiary, some of the late game attributes are a little bit annoying to get, although it does seem like they're fixing that in general, and most stuff on the Crimson Isle as well. Trophy fishing can be a little bit obnoxious, although I would argue trophy fishing is a little more auxiliary, but other than that, there's stuff like the reputation gains, which are just slow and kind of annoying. So what should they do? My view of it is reduce those grinds by a factor of 2 to 3 or 4 even, which would be a reduction in around 50 to 75% of the playtime. Right now, I would say for a new player to get to the point where they could be considered late game, it would probably take them around 2,000 hours. Obviously, it's way less than that if you're doing it very efficiently, but most people do not play Skyblock as a job, shockingly enough, and I don't think using that level of efficiency as a baseline is very good. Most people who play Skyblock are kids, or teenagers, or young adults, and they don't have the time to spend 15 hours a day on this game. You need to make the game's content more catered to these players. Now, I don't think that should be done for no reason. A big problem we've been having recently for the current endgame community is that a lot of updates that we've been getting have not been very good for endgame. They have not been endgame updates. We have gotten very few new bosses, new dungeons, and things like that, and I actually really like that endgame, late game content, especially when it's not gear dependent and it's more skill dependent. We need more of it. So here's my thought process, right? You take the game, you make it way easier to get through. You add a bunch of early game features to get people into the game, which would be stuff like Hina's chapters on every island. I've gone over this over and over again. And then you allow people to get to the late game, where they're able to do most of the game's content, if not all of it, maybe not with the most efficiency, but most of the game's content, in around 400 to 500 hours. I think that is somewhat reasonable. You have to keep in mind, that's how most MMOs run. The only MMO that doesn't really run like that, that's super massive at the moment, is RuneScape. But RuneScape benefits from having its current grinding system a lot more fun than the current Skyblock system. Most Skyblock content is not the most interesting past the first 10 hours. A lot of RuneScape stuff is, and that's the big differentiator there. And once again, it's not reasonable to just say to the admins, hey guys, make your content fun. Obviously, it would be great in a perfect world if we could do that, but that would take way too long, we would get no content ever again. It's way easier to change numbers down than it is to just say rework everything. So what you would do, you lower the time investment to get to the late game, and then you can allow the development team to focus more on late game content. I'm going to be honest here, the reason that we haven't gotten much late game, end game content in Skyblock over the past year, 2, 3 years is because it doesn't make sense to make any of it. If you look at my level, I am not very good at this game, but I am in the top 0.02% of players. That is a very, very small group. Obviously, if you design stuff for people who are way higher level than me, you're not going to get a very big player base. And that's not logical to develop for. That's why we've been getting a lot of mid-game, early-game updates, which are good and are appreciated, but I think they're not helping in terms of bloating out the mid-game. It's just making it even more incomprehensible for a new player to get into. You need to streamline things in the forms of quest lines and things like that, and you also need to reduce the grind. And this goes for everything, frankly. I've talked on stream at length. Things like Hyperion, the parts of Hyperion, so the handle and the scrolls, should be bare minimum 1% drop rates in stuff like Floor 7. Floor 7 is not endgame anymore. M7 is. I wouldn't change something like Claymore, for example. But for Floor 7, I think it should be more reasonable for the average person to get a Hyperion. I think the same with the Giant Sword. I think a lot of the early game things that you get in dungeons need to be significantly buffed in terms of their drop rates. Now, I've seen a lot of people say, oh, Derailious, this would have problems in the game. The first problem they bring up frequently is the economy. And I don't really see the argument here because the economy has always changed. Skyblock in 2019, it was way easier to get something like a late game piece of gear than it is right now. Hyperions back then were about 300 mil, and it wasn't that hard to get them. And that was more in 2021, obviously, when, Dungeons was out significantly. Regardless, I don't think saying the economy would change is a reason not to do this. Another thing I see people say a lot is, well, what about the current endgame community? And frankly, I don't have a great solution for the current endgame community. You would be losing out a lot of time. Like, a lot of time would feel like it was wasted if this stuff happened. But the best thing I can say is, with these changes, at least the admins would be able to develop new endgame stuff, and you would be able to get new content. Obviously, that's cold comfort. I don't know what the actual solution is there, but that's something that theoretically would need to be taken into account. For a lot of people, I think the answer is just going to be, I'm sorry, but this was how the game needs to be. We need to change the game in order to keep up with CCU, in order to prevent the game from trailing off. This is just what needs to happen. The third thing I see is, would the game be too easy? And I just don't think that this is true. The game already is very easy. It's just very long. I would rather the game not feel bloated in playtime, and I would rather the developers focus on adding new and interesting content, which they would be able to, because the end game would be opened up because so many more people would be there. The fourth thing I see pretty often is, what would we grind for? Right? Like, why would we still play the game? And I think there's a lot of things you would still grind for. A lot of endgame accessories and things like that, for sure. If you already have all of those, stuff like Chimera, I'm not arguing to change that. A lot of cosmetic stuff, obviously, to go for in the late game. Dyes, things like that. But also, I truly and honestly believe you shift the way the game's playtime looks. You allow people to get the first 90% of their skill, their power, very, very easily, or relatively easily, right? Like, you can get a base Claymore, or not base Claymore, a base Derailious Blade, a base Hyperion, very, very easily. But the hard part of that, in my view, should be the maxing out of that item. So the tier 7 enchants, the gemstones, and even something like the hot potato books and fumings, which I think are way too easy to get right now. They kind of trivialize that upgrade system. It's just something you get basically for free on every weapon. I don't think that that should be that way. I would love to see those items move to different pieces of content, so you actually have to work for those stat upgrades, because I'm going to be honest, while they are significant, they're not the most important, part of the game. I think more people would rather be able to say, hey, at least I can get a Hyperion in a decent amount of time, and I can get the fumings and hot potato books over the next 50 hours, rather than saying, well, at least I have a billion fumings and a billion hot potato books, but this Hyperion's going to take me 150 hours to get, you know what I mean? Like, that's the difference there. I don't know, this is just my general view of Skyblock as time has gone on. Things need to change, the game needs to change in order to survive and keep up with other MMOs, with other things that people are playing, and people just don't have the time anymore. It's not COVID anymore, and even during COVID, I'm going to be real, 2019, 2020, this game was not nearly as grindy. You logged on for an hour every single day, you updated your minions, and you got yourself a pigman sword, or you got yourself a guaranteed ember rod at the end of a boss, or you just got stuff way faster back then. Things take a lot more time now, and I think in 2022, 2021, they made a design post where they were like, hey, we don't want the game to take longer, and since then, they've just added like an extra 1,000 hours of bloat, and I really worry about what that means in the future, because the game needs to rehabilitate its image among the general public, who sees it as nothing more than a grind fest. I would love to hear what you guys think in the comments down below. Feel free to disagree, but this is just the thought process that I've came to over a very long time. I don't think you're going to convince me, And if I wasn't able to convince you, that's totally fine. But if I was, would love to hear what you think as well. And let me know your thoughts about this video. I will still be doing Skyblock news, so don't you worry about that. That's still going to be a thing that I'm obviously going to be doing. I'm going to be playing the game. I will be here no matter what. And I will always be trying to advocate for the early mid-game players, frankly for everybody, but especially for the early and mid-game players. Look to the future, fellas. I'll see you then.